Well, hello there. I didn't see you come in. Make yourself at home. Have a drink. While I give some attention to some underappreciated characters and storylines that I personally love. And I hope you grow to love as well. Hey there, everybody. Welcome back. Today we are reading Swamp Thing number 113. And just a little catch up on what's been going on. In the last issue, we found out that there is a gubernatorial race going on in Louisiana, and both the Democrat, who's the incumbent, and the Republican suck. So in an act of protest, a group of college kids and their professor decided it would be fun and interesting to nominate Swamp Thing to run for governor. And they did this thinking he wasn't real. At least no one had seen him really, except in Gotham. So to them, this is essentially the same thing as nominating Mickey Mouse and then people taking it seriously. And the reason why the media is taking it seriously is because they're doing polls around Louisiana and people are actually voting for Swamp Thing. He has a 20% vote ratio in the polls. And that is what's causing the other candidates to really take this like it's a serious matter. And also a side plot that's going on in the last couple issues was that Chester has been left by his longtime partner, Liz Tremaine. She broke up with him. He's pretty sad about it, but he's getting over it in time with the help of his friends Swamp Thing and Abby. And that is where we left off on the last issue. So first things first, with issue 113, we got the cover here. We see Swamp Thing is walking through a swamp, of course, and the sun rays are shining through the canopies above. And we see down in the water, it looks like maybe they've fallen down out of fright, but there are some cameramen and possibly a news reporter, and they are looking up at Swamp Thing in terror, and Swamp Thing doesn't even seem to notice them. He seems to just be walking by, and they just happen to be at his feet, and he's not paying any attention. And we also see that this is written by Nancy A. Collins with art by Tom Yeats and Shepard Hendricks. So we start off on the first page with a news reporter talking about the kerfuffle of the polls having a 20% vote for Swamp Thing. And they show some press releases of the Democrats and the Republican who are running. And the Democrat is saying, "This is an outrage. It's this kind of tomfoolery that gives Louisiana politics a bad name." And the Republican candidate is saying, "As an elected lawmaker, I take politics seriously. I voted to repeal abortion, vetoed the anti-spousal rape bill, approved the amendment that okayed beating up flag-burning hippies, and I'm on the committee to ban rap music. But running a vegetable for high public office is stupid." And then because they can't get Swamp Thing's quote because they can't find him, they do get an interview from the teacher who nominated Swamp Thing in the first place. And he's saying, "As far as I'm concerned, the fact that so many Louisiana voters would like to elect a 7-foot-tall bog monster to the office of governor says something about the grassroots changes that need to be made in the state's political system." And then to finish it off, the news reporter says, "Meanwhile, Swamp Thing remains incommunicado. Channel 44's own Harlan Eaglet and Angelica Hummock are, even as I speak, traveling into the heart of Terrebonne Parish's Bayou country in search of an exclusive interview with the elusive Swamp Man. Stay tuned throughout the week for further updates." And as that broadcast finishes, we get a political ad by the Republican candidate Ben Barron, and it's one of those targeted ads, and this one is specifically targeted at Swamp Thing, and it says, "What does anyone really know about the shambling muck monster called Swamp Thing? What are his opinions on abortion, affirmative action, the homestead exemption, the lottery? Why hasn't he come forward to engage his opponents in debate on these important issues?" And under this narration, we see like a zoom-in picture of Swamp Thing's face. And I think it's actually from the original photo, or it's a photo where he kind of looks angry, so it makes him look like a jerk. And then the next narration, the photo is of him and a naked Abby in the swamp. These are the same photos, I'm assuming, that were published in the tabloid during Alan Moore's run, and that was why she got arrested in Gotham. And the ad continues, "And what about his morals? Is this the kind of woman the people of Louisiana want in the governor's mansion?" And then a giant American flag scrolls down the screen with a big eagle on top of it, and the narration continues, "Vote for Ben Barron, because he's right." Then we cut to Houma, Louisiana at the Sandman Inn, and we see the News 44 van is parked in front, and we cut inside the room, and we see the reporters are all waiting for their guide to show up. And if you don't remember the guide from the last issue, he was the one-handed man named Merle Layton, and at the end of that issue, we saw that in preparation for his guided journey into the swamp, Mr. Layton decided to get a special gun made that will fit over his stump on his right hand. Very reminiscent of Ash from The Evil Dead with his chainsaw hand. And he did this because he's under the impression that the thing that took his hand in the swamp was Swamp Thing. So he's going to take these people out, but he's also going to try to shoot Swamp Thing at the same time. So Merle eventually shows up and knocks on the door. And of course, the second that they open the door, they see a man with a shotgun for a hand, and they are stunned, of course. And not only does Merle have a shotgun for his right hand, in his left hand, he's drinking a beer. So obviously, he's not big on gun safety. And as they open the door, he says, "All right, I'm ready to rock and roll." And we see that the name of this issue is Fear and Loathing on the Bayou Trail. Then we cut to the Swamp Thing residence, where we see Chester and Abby are leaving on a boat as Swamp Thing and Tefe are waving goodbye to them from the bank. And Chester says, "Abby, you don't really have to do this." And Abby says, "I want to, Chester. Besides, what are friends for?" And Chester replies, "It's just that I've been such a bother already, showing up on your doorstep drunk and half out of my mind, and then you and Alec putting me up for the weekend." And Abby cuts in, "Don't worry about it, Chester. After all the things you've done for us, it's the least we could do." And then we cut to them just arriving at the bank where he left his car, and Chester remarks, "Geez, I really walked all the way to your place from here? It's a miracle I didn't get my legs chewed off." And then we see Chester and Abby get into his car, and apparently she's going to drive back with him. And when he thanks her for this, she says, "I thought you might want some company. Besides, Alec and Tefe need to spend some quality time together." And as they're driving, we see the News 44 van pass on the opposite side of the road, going to where Chester and Abby just came from. And I guess the news reporters just let Merle drive, even though he has a shotgun for a hand and he's drinking. But it seems like maybe they're second guessing themselves, because one of them is asking, "Are you sure you know where you're going?" And Merle says, "Sure, I'm sure. I'll just take a left on that dirt road." And I don't think I've described Merle previously except his shotgun hand, but he basically looks like Carl from Aqua Teen Hunger Force if Carl was wearing regular jeans instead of sweatpants, and he had on a plaid short sleeve shirt. So Merle continues to reassure them, "If there's anything I know more about than women and drinking, it's this here swamp." And rightly so, the reporters are still unsure about him. And when they arrive at the destination he's trying to show them, it turns out it's the exact same area, like literally the same tree that Chester was parked next to. So they are actually in the right area, and it turns out Merle actually knows what he's talking about. So as they get out of the van, he of course tells them, "All right, we got to start walking into the swamp here." And I guess the reporters just thought Swamp Thing was going to be on the bank of the road or something, because the female reporter is pretty angry that she's going to have to walk in the swamp because she's wearing $300 boots and just got her hair done, which I'm not sure why she's worried about that unless she accidentally falls in the water. And we see that the competition between the two reporters is still going strong, because the male reporter acts like this is no big deal. He says, "Merle's right, Angelica. We're out here to land a story. And if that means wading up to our hips in mud, then by damn, that's what we'll do." But then the second he steps in the water, he goes, "Yuck." So he was obviously just saying that to make himself look good and put her down in front of the others. Then we come back to Chester and Abby, and they're arriving at his house, and when they get in there, he realizes he left this place in a bit of a mess. There's beer cans all over the floor, and he says, "Boy, I was drunker than I thought. I went off and left the house unlocked with all the lights on and the television running." And it's important that he did leave the television running, because right as they walk in, the ad I read earlier by Ben Barron, the Republican candidate, is playing, the one that's specifically anti-Swamp Thing. And Abby gets super mad, of course, because not only are they talking about her husband in a very bad way, they're showing the partially nude photos of Swamp Thing and her again on TV. So she sees this and goes, "What? Not again? Why can't people leave us alone? Why?" And she begins to kick all the cans that are on the ground. And Chester goes over to her and he tries to calm her down. He says, Abby, calm down. Don't take it so seriously. Obviously, this is someone's idea of a joke. Surely no one in his right mind would believe Alec is running for public office." And right as he says that, we cut to the swamp, where the news reporters are trying to find Swamp Thing so they can get an exclusive. And it seems they've been following Merle for hours, because the male reporter says, Mr. Layton, we've been walking close to an hour and we still haven't sighted the Swamp Thing." And Merle turns to him and says, You can't go traipsing around in the bayou expecting to catch sight of him right off the bat. Critters like that gotta be tracked, hunted down like wild animals. Me, I come from a long line of gator hunters. My grandpa, he trapped the gators and sold their hides in New Orleans for nigh on to 40 years. Of course, that was before a gator chomped off his left leg. So Merle continues to talk about his family members who have lost appendages or body parts to alligators. And while he's doing that, he's walking by a willow tree, and this tree's leaves kind of hang down on vines and they're all bushy. So something kind of spreads them open like a curtain. We see the hands, they look webbed, almost like the creature from the Black Lagoon or something. And we can see whatever these hands belong to is watching Merle talk. And then we cut to the thing behind those willow curtains, and it is some sort of weird amalgamation of a monster. It looks to be made of 2 or 3 people. It's got 3 heads, and underneath those heads where their mouths would be all connect to one giant mouth that has big pointy sharp teeth, and all the limbs that are human limbs still are all connected underneath the abdomen, so it basically looks like it has spider legs. And unfortunately for Merle, one of the heads of this spider body swamp monster is a woman that he used to go out with. And as that head sees Merle talking, she remembers what happened with her and Merle. So we cut to a flashback where it's the middle of the night, it's on some bridge in Huma, and Merle has driven this woman to this bridge, and she's saying as he's pulling her out of the car, I could have gone to the New Orleans clinic, gotten taken care of proper. It only cost a couple $100. So basically she's insinuating that she is pregnant with Merle's baby and he does not want that. So like I said, they're on a bridge and he's forcefully pulling her out of a car, and he's saying, that's $200 I couldn't afford. Besides, if you douched proper, none of this would have happened. What makes you think I'm going to take you to the hospital? They charge 1,000 smackers just so you can set your foot in the door. And then he drags her to the edge of the bridge and he proceeds to throw her off. And as he does, he says, tough luck, bitch. And then the woman screams, Mel, as she falls. And in the panel, it doesn't necessarily look like it's that high of a bridge, but apparently she does, or at least gets turned into some kind of swamp monster along with some other bodies that were in the swamp as well. And like I said, we don't get any explanation on this. We were just dropped into this one memory of this monster randomly. So as the monster's remembering this, she's thinking to herself, kill? Kill who? Kill who? Kill. Yes. And as Merle walks by this willow tree, the monster attacks and she yells out, Mel. And Merle sees it and raises his gun hand, and he even has time to recognize her because he says, Carmen? But he's not able to get a shot off before his arm goes into the monster's mouth. But as the monster chomps down, he does get a shot off and it shoots, I guess, through the back of it. And the reporters who you might think would be ready to see some kind of monster or swamp thing are not ready at all. They don't have any of their equipment set up, and they're not even paying attention to him because I guess they got bored with the stories that he was telling about his family. So they were far enough behind that they didn't see any of this. They just see him run out from behind the willow tree. His gun is fallen off his stump, and he's yelling, help, help, she's after me. She's gonna kill me. She's gonna. And as he's running, he's not looking where he's going, and he trips over something in the water and he falls down. And as he's getting back up out of the water, he's trying to apologize to Carmen, saying, I'm sorry, Carmen. I didn't mean to, honest. It weren't my fault. Please don't kill me. And as he's pulling himself up saying this, he realizes that where he's pulling himself up is not a good place to be. He looks around and he sees a bunch of eggs on this piece of ground and also a bunch of baby alligators. So in his haste to run from this monster, apparently he has fallen into an alligator nest, which of course is not a good place to be because the mom and dad are always close by. And one of the parents begins to attack Merle, and as he screams out, we cut to Swamp Thing, who's nearby playing with Tefe, and they hear the screams, and Tefe looks at Swamp Thing and says, Dada? And then we cut back to the scene where Merle is still being attacked. We're not seeing the carnage, but we are seeing the reporters all of a sudden get their gear ready, and the reporters are yelling, pictures, we need pictures. And then as the microphone and cameraman guy get closer to the attack, of course they don't help or anything, they just focus on the carnage. And the reporters are like, maybe on second thought we shouldn't show someone being murdered by an alligator on TV. And just as the male reporter is saying this, all of a sudden, out of some bushes, Swamp Thing appears with Tefe on his shoulders, and he says, "What is going on here? Who are you people?" And the cameraman, he knows what he's doing. He stops filming the gator and automatically puts Swamp Thing in front of the camera. And Swamp Thing doesn't get an answer from anybody, but he sees Merle's dead body in the water, and he points to it and he says, "Which of you did this?" And the male reporter begins to answer, but he's kind of weirdly giddy and nervous as he's talking to Swamp Thing, and he's trying to say to Swamp Thing that it was an accident and that a gator did it. But before he could say anything else, the female reporter pushes her way past him and says, "Out of my way, pretty boy, and watch a real telejournalist work." So she walks right up to Swamp Thing and says, "Mr. Swamp Thing, what are your plans concerning the upcoming governor's election? Do you have an opinion concerning fiscal reform for next year's budget? And what, if any, is your connection to the Green Party of Western Germany?" And of course, Swamp Thing's confused because he's never heard of his campaign yet, and he also hasn't seen any of the commercials. So he says, "This is a joke, right?" And then we cut back to Chester's house, where Chester is leaving with Abby. And as they exit the front door, someone off panel yells, "There she is!" And we see a whole horde of reporters are just waiting for her, and they begin to yell out questions. "News break, Miss Cable. What's your reaction to the Ben Barron ad that's been running on the television the last few days? U.S. Newsies, World Reportage. Where is Swamp Thing? Will you be making public appearances with him in the future? Saturday Evening World. Is it true you murdered your first husband? World Weekly Bazaar. Is it true that you're the niece of the notorious Nazi war criminal Dr. Anton Arcane?" And Abby's overwhelmed by all this questioning, of course, so her and Chester begin to wade through the reporters, and she's trying not to answer any of their questions. She's saying, like, "That's none of your business." And they're even asking Chester questions. They're saying, "What are you, buddy? Are you Swamp Thing's campaign manager?" And Chester says, "No, just a family friend." And eventually they are able to push their way through all these reporters and to Chester's van. And the last reporter that can get a word out says, "Miss Cable, just one quote before you go, please." And as Abby closes the door, she says, "My name isn't Cable, it's Holland. Mrs. Alec Holland, damn it. Leave us alone." And then as Chester and her drive away, she gives them all the finger. And inside the van, Abby's of course still mad as they're driving, and she's saying, "I can't believe those people. Isn't there an earthquake or a fire or a schoolyard massacre they can cover? Why do they have to pick on us?" And Chester doesn't really know what to say, so he just goes to the radio and he says, "Maybe some music will calm you down." And as he clicks it on, there's no music, of course. Right away, there's a news report, and it says, "And in other news, the award-winning anchor team of Harlan Eaglet and Angelica Hummock have been officially listed as missing by their employer, Channel 44 Eyeball Witness News. Harlan and Angelica, along with a two-person video team, went on the assignment into the Bayou country of Terrebonne Parish in an attempt to land an exclusive interview with gubernatorial dark horse Swamp Thing. Police have not ruled out possible foul play." And then we get a comedic panel where we see the van driving down the road from like a bird's eye view, and we can hear Abby yelling, and then we hear Chester say, "Maybe I should have played a tape instead." Then we get back to the swamp where the body of Merle is being loaded into the Channel 44 news van by the camera crew. And it looks like Swamp Thing has helped them come back here because, of course, they don't know how to get out of the bayou, and Merle was dead. So Swamp Thing led them back here, and he's talking to the female reporter, and he says, "Here is your vehicle. I suggest you report your guide's accident to the state police and return to New Orleans." But it seems like the reporter just is ignoring Swamp Thing. All she cares about is that story because she says, "Now, about that exclusive." And Swamp Thing says, "I have already stated, I do not wish to comment. I knew nothing of my candidacy until you informed me about it." And the reporter says back to him, "But there's so much about you that's not on public record. Where are you from? What about your wife and child? Surely the people have a right to know." And Swamp Thing says, "I would prefer you keep my family out of this. This swamp was my birthplace. Now it's home to both me and my loved ones. I was begat in the bayou, and the bayou is part of me. Know this, the swamp welcomes visitors, but it knows how to deal with trespassers." And while he was saying these last couple things about him being born in the swamp, he holds up his hand to the reporter, and in his palm is a flower growing, and then that flower kind of blossoms into a different kind of flower, and then all of a sudden, as he says the word trespassers threateningly, it turns into a vine of thorns. And then it kind of wiggles at her threateningly, and she does seem pretty shocked by this, because they don't say anything else to Swamp Thing. They just pack their stuff up quickly and drive out of there. And as the news van leaves, Chester's van pulls up, And Abby gets out and she sees Swamp Thing and the baby and she says, "Alec, thank God." And then she runs over to them and gives them a big hug and says, "It was horrible, Alec, just like the time they took me to Gotham City." And Swamp Thing says, "Abby, what's wrong? Why are you back so soon?" And she says, "Reporters were everywhere, asking questions, taking pictures, Alec. You're a candidate for governor." "Honey, what are we gonna do?" And then Chester chimes in and he says, "You could always hold a press conference." And Abby turns to him kind of mad and says, "Chester, I'm serious." But Swamp Thing looks up like he's thinking and he says, "You know, that's not such a bad idea." Then we cut to the headquarters of that student political organization, and all the students and the teacher are talking about how well this is going, and they can't believe the news reporters actually went to the swamp, and what do they think they're gonna find? And the teacher says, "Hard to believe that the media fell hook, line, and sinker for our promoting Swamp Thing. I don't know whether I should feel proud or disgusted." And as he's saying this, there's a plant in the corner that's hanging, and we see that it begins to grow. And then a vine shoots down, and a body begins to form at the table edge. And before their eyes, Swamp Thing appears, and he's like leaning on the edge of the table, like he's talking to them sternly. And the kids and the professor are like, "Wow, what do you know? He is real." And Swamp Thing looks at them and says, "Which of you is my campaign manager?" And the teacher, who's still in shock, says, "I guess that's me. It was my idea for you to run for governor." And as the teacher's saying this, Swamp Thing's looking around and seeing the organization's posters and stuff, and a lot of them say like Greenpeace and no nukes, and they have a peace sign on them. So Swamp Thing's seeing like, oh, these guys aren't necessarily bad people, but he still asks them, "You did this without asking my permission?" And the teacher kind of smiles and puts his hands up like he's scared, and he says, "Well, you see, we weren't really sure that you were, real. It was meant as a joke." And Swamp Thing says, "I see. Unfortunately, your joke has just proven anything but for both me and my family. Still, I can remember what it was like to be a college student." And this kind of blows the kids' minds, and they say, "You do?" And then we see Swamp Thing examining the poster that they made for him for governor, and he says, "In a way, I'm flattered, but the joke has gone on too long, and it's getting dangerously out of hand." And the teacher says, "Look, we're sorry if we infringed on your personal freedom. That's not what we intended to do." And Swamp Thing says, "I know. If you wish to repair the damage that has been done, there is something you must do for me. Issue a publicity release stating that I will be holding a press conference on the steps of the state capitol." Then we cut to Baton Rouge on the steps of the state capitol, where the other two Democrat and Republican candidates are also waiting. It seems that the kids and the teacher did their job, and all the press and the governor candidates are waiting for Swamp Thing to show up. And the reporters are asking the incumbent Democrat governor, "What's your reaction to the Swamp Thing's announcement that he'll be making a public address on the Capitol steps this afternoon?" And the governor says, "Pure poppycock. You stand a better chance of interviewing a tooth fairy." And then the reporters ask the Republican candidate, "Mr. Barron, are you planning on debating Swamp Thing?" And Barron answers, "I have serious doubts as to whether my so-called adversary will be showing his face this afternoon, assuming he has a face." And then the reporter asks both of them, "Governor, Mr. Barron, what are your plans should Swamp Thing put in an appearance?" And the governor responds, "I'm tired of hearing about that overgrown tossed salad. I'm more interested in putting this silliness behind us and getting on with the business of electing a real governor." And as he says this, we see a sprout of plant life begin to form on the steps between them. And before they know it, it seems like Swamp Thing grows super fast, and it seems like he made himself extra big. I mean, I know he's already like 7 feet tall, but it looks like he might have grown himself a little bit bigger this time. And he's in between them, and he puts his hands on their shoulders, and he says, "Gentlemen, I couldn't agree more with you. Now, about that press conference, I am flattered that a considerable number of Louisiana's citizens consider me a worthy candidate for the governor's office. However, if nominated, I shall not run. If elected, I shall not serve." And then one reporter asks, "Swamp Thing, does this mean you're uninterested in politics?" And Swamp Thing looks at her with his deep eyes and he says, "Politics are man-made, while nature has her own agenda." And then another reporter asks, "Swamp Thing, is there anything you'd like to say concerning the negative ad campaign focused on you and your wife?" And then Swamp Thing gets very mad and he says, "Yes, there is. And then he turns to the Republican candidate who ran the ad, and he's pointing right at his face, and he says, "You can say whatever you like about me, but if you ever dare talk about my wife again, Mr. Barron, you will find a rose bush growing where the sun don't shine." And then the pointer finger that Swamp Thing is pointing at Barron with begins to grow out, and it turns into kind of like a whip or a vine. And it has a little thorn at the end of it that Swamp Thing uses to cut open Barron's cheek. And this is to let Barron know that Swamp Thing ain't messing around. And with that, Swamp Thing's done. And even though the reporters are trying to ask him more questions, Swamp Thing's body begins to dissolve and fall apart as he leaves back into the green. And as he leaves, the Republican candidate Barron is touching his cheek where the cut is, and he's thinking to himself, "Just wait, Mudman, just you wait." And then we cut to Swamp Thing and Abby and Tefe at Chester's house with Chester. And of course, this was at a time when the news wasn't a 24-hour cycle, so it is probably now evening, and this news story is running at like the 5 o'clock news. And we're just at the tail end of Swamp Thing's little speech where he's saying, "If nominated, I shall not run. If elected, I shall not serve." And Abby turns to Swamp Thing and says, "Where have I heard that quote before?" And if you're like me, you just realized, oh, that was a quote from someone. So I had to look this up to check on it. And I thought maybe it was like Robert Kennedy or something, but apparently LBJ said this. And this comic came out in 91, so maybe it was more remembered back then because it had only been 20 years, but I completely forgot. So anyway, Swamp Thing says, "I'm glad it's all over." And Abby says, "So am I. Still, I wonder what it would have been like in the governor's mansion. You know, if being an elemental doesn't pan out, you could always go into politics. After all, you're a natural stump speaker." And just like all of us reading, Chester says, "Groan." And that, my friends, is the end of the issue. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains@comicbooks, all one word, @gmail.com. And until next time, remember to stay swampy.